I never thought a few propane tanks would turn me into the most hated man in Pinewood Heights until the day everything fell apart and they came crawling back. My name is Keith O'Brien, and I moved to this upscale neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado, 3 years ago with my wife Emma. The mountain views were spectacular, the houses pristine, and the community seemed perfect. We bought a beautiful 4-bedroom home at the end of Cascade Drive, backing up to National Forest land. I worked as a geological engineer, and Emma taught chemistry at the local high school. Life was good, or at least it was until Brenda Morrison became HOA president. Brenda was everything you would expect from a homeowner association dictator. Mid-50s. Perfectly highlighted blonde hair, always styled in that speak-to-your-manager cut, designer athleisure, where that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and an attitude that suggested she personally owned every blade of grass in the neighborhood. She had moved to Pinewood Heights 2 years ago after her divorce settlement, immediately inserting herself into every committee, every board, every decision that affected our 200-home community. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was in my driveway installing 3 large propane storage tanks that I had just purchased. These were not small camping cylinders. These were serious 500-gallon tanks, the kind you see at rural properties. I had done my research, obtained all the necessary permits from Boulder County, and hired a licensed contractor to ensure everything met safety codes. My property sat on 2 acres, much larger than most lots in the neighborhood, and my house had a unique setup. The previous owner had installed a propane-powered backup generator, propane fireplace inserts throughout the house, and a propane water heater. When we bought the place, we discovered the heating system was actually a hybrid setup, mostly electric but with propane supplementation for efficiency during extreme cold snaps. Living at 7,000 feet elevation in Colorado, those cold snaps were not hypothetical. The thing was, propane delivery in our area had become increasingly unreliable. The local supplier had been bought out by a regional company that kept missing deliveries, showing up late, and generally providing terrible service. Last winter, we had nearly run out twice, and one of those times the temperature dropped to -15 degrees. I had decided I was not going through that stress again. Hence the large storage tanks, which would hold enough propane to last us through 2 winters if necessary. I was directing the crane operator when Brenda's silver Lexus SUV pulled up. She climbed out, designer sunglasses perched on her head, already holding her phone like a weapon. "Keith, what on earth are you doing?" Her voice had that particular pitch that made my jaw clench. "Installing propane tanks. Morning, Brenda." I kept my tone neutral. I had learned early on that giving Brenda any emotional ammunition was a mistake. You cannot just install industrial tanks in a residential neighborhood. This is absolutely unacceptable. She was already taking photos, her thumbs flying across her screen. "I have all the permits. The county inspector signed off yesterday. Everything is up to code." "I do not care about county permits. You need HOA approval for any exterior modifications, and those things are hideous." She gestured at the tanks like they were radioactive waste. The tanks were actually not that bad. They were painted a neutral sage green to blend with the surrounding landscape, positioned behind a decorative fence that the contractor had just finished building, and barely visible from the street. But I could see this was not really about aesthetics. The HOA guidelines do not specifically prohibit utility storage. I checked before I started the project. I had, in fact, spent hours reading through the 60-page covenant document. Section 12, Paragraph 7 states that no unsightly equipment or storage may be visible from neighboring properties or public streets. Brenda had apparently memorized the entire document, which was both impressive and deeply concerning. Which is why I built the fence. You cannot even see them from the street. I can see them from here. She pointed at the tanks, which were currently visible because we were standing in my driveway, looking directly at them. You are in my driveway, Brenda. Her face flushed. The HOA board will be hearing about this. I am calling an emergency meeting. She stormed back to her Lexus and peeled out, leaving rubber marks on the street. The contractor, a weathered guy named Miguel who had been doing this for 20 years, gave me a sympathetic look. HOA problems, he asked. Always. I have seen this before. They cannot actually make you remove these, you know. You have got all the legal permits. HOA covenants cannot override county safety regulations. I know, but that will not stop her from trying. Miguel was right, of course, but he underestimated Brenda's determination. That evening, I found a notice in my mailbox, printed on official HOA letterhead. It informed me that an emergency board meeting had been scheduled for Thursday evening to discuss my flagrant violation of community standards. I was required to attend and defend my unauthorized modifications, or face immediate fines and legal action. Emma read the letter over my shoulder, her dark hair still damp from her post-work shower. She cannot be serious. Oh, she is always serious. But you have permits. Legal permits from the county. That has never stopped Brenda before. I thought about the Johnsons 3 streets over, who had spent 6 months fighting the HOA over their vegetable garden. Or the Patels, who had been fined for painting their front door a slightly different shade of approved beige. Brenda's HOA board had a reputation for prioritizing aesthetics over common sense. Thursday evening arrived too quickly. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a beautiful building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. About 30 residents had shown up, which was unusual. Most HOA meetings attracted maybe a dozen people, usually the same busybodies who had nothing better to do. But controversy brought out the crowds. Brenda sat at the head table with her 4 board members. Richard Chen, who owned a real estate agency and generally went along with whatever Brenda wanted. Patricia Donovan, a retired accountant who took meeting minutes with obsessive precision. Marcus Webb, a lawyer who should have known better but seemed to enjoy the petty drama. And Susan Fletcher, the only reasonable person on the board, who often looked tired during these meetings. This meeting will come to order. Brenda banged a gavel that she had purchased herself, since HOA meetings do not actually require gavels. We are here to address Keith O'Brien's unauthorized installation of industrial storage equipment in clear violation of our community covenants. I raised my hand. I have permits. You did not have HOA approval, which is required under Section 12. Section 12 refers to exterior modifications like additions, deck construction, and permanent structures. Utility equipment is covered under Section 15, which allows necessary equipment for home maintenance and safety, provided it meets county codes. I had done my homework. Susan Fletcher actually nodded slightly, which gave me hope. Marcus Webb leaned forward, his expensive suit probably worth more than my monthly salary. The covenant language is somewhat ambiguous. However, the spirit of the regulation clearly indicates that maintaining neighborhood aesthetics is paramount. The tanks are not visible from the street. I built a fence specifically to screen them. I pulled out my phone and showed photos from various angles. They are visible from the Hendersons' property. Brenda had photos too, apparently taken from my neighbor's yard, which meant she had been trespassing or had convinced the Hendersons to let her snoop. Barely, and only if you stand at the very back corner of their lot and crane your neck. The Hendersons have not complained. That is irrelevant. The board has determined that your installation violates community standards. You have 30 days to remove the tanks or face daily fines of $100. The room erupted. Several residents started shouting questions, and I heard at least 3 people arguing with each other about property rights versus community obligations. "This is insane," I said, standing up. "I followed every legal requirement. I have a legitimate need for propane storage because of the unreliable delivery service in this area. You cannot fine me for something that is legal and necessary. We can, and we will. The covenants give this board authority to maintain property values and community standards. Your industrial tanks are unsightly and inappropriate for a residential neighborhood." Brenda's voice had that final, imperious tone that she used when she considered a matter closed. "I want to see the board vote on this," Susan Fletcher said suddenly. "This should not be a unilateral decision." Brenda looked annoyed but could not refuse. "Fine. All in favor of requiring Keith O'Brien to remove the propane tanks within 30 days. Brenda, Richard, Patricia, and Marcus raised their hands. Susan abstained. Motion carries. You will receive official notification tomorrow. Brenda banged her gavel again, clearly pleased with herself. I left the meeting furious but not surprised. Emma was waiting in the car and I filled her in on the decision during the drive home. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Fight it. I am not removing the tanks. We need them, and I did everything legally. Brenda will make our lives miserable. She already does that." Over the next 2 weeks, I consulted with 3 different attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. The consensus was that I had a strong case. The HOA covenants could not override county safety codes, and my propane tanks met all legal requirements. However, fighting the HOA would be expensive and time-consuming. The attorneys estimated it could cost $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees, even though I would likely win. Meanwhile, Brenda ramped up her campaign against me. She sent emails to every resident in the neighborhood, complete with photos of my tanks, describing them as dangerous industrial equipment that threatened property values and community safety. She conveniently left out the part about permits and county approval. The reaction was mixed. Some neighbors thought Brenda was overreaching. Others, particularly those who lived closest to her and seemed to fear her wrath, sided with her position. The neighborhood Facebook group became a war zone, with daily arguments about property rights, HOA authority, and whether my tanks were actually visible or not. Then the fine started. October 1st, I received a letter informing me that I was being fined $100 per day, retroactive to the date of the board meeting. By my calculation, that was already $1,400 and climbing. I refused to pay. Instead, I filed a formal dispute and hired one of the attorneys, a sharp woman named Jennifer Martinez, who had successfully fought several HOA cases in Colorado. She sent a cease and desist letter to the board, explaining that their fines were legally invalid and that pursuing them could result in the board members being held personally liable for harassment. Brenda responded by increasing the fines to $200 per day. "She is going to bankrupt herself and the HOA," Jennifer told me during a phone call. "The association's insurance will not cover this kind of overreach. When we win, and we will win, the HOA will owe you damages, legal fees, and possibly punitive damages for bad faith enforcement. I do not want to destroy the HOA. I just want to keep my tanks. I understand, but Brenda is not giving you much choice. She is being incredibly unreasonable. October rolled into November and the weather started to change. Colorado weather is unpredictable, but experienced locals can feel it when a serious system is coming. The air gets that particular crisp quality. The clouds start building in specific patterns, and every weather forecast starts throwing around terms like Arctic front and historic storm. By mid-November, meteorologists were tracking a massive winter storm system developing in the Gulf of Alaska. The forecasts were ominous. Temperatures could drop to -20 or below, sustained winds over 50 miles per hour, and snowfall measured in feet rather than inches. They were calling it a potentially historic blizzard, the kind that happened maybe once or twice a decade. Pinewood Heights was not unfamiliar with snow, but this was shaping up to be different. The county issued early warnings, recommending that residents stock up on supplies, check their heating systems, and prepare for potential power outages. I spent a weekend making preparations. I had the generator serviced, stocked up on food and water, made sure we had plenty of firewood for the fireplace, and checked all our propane connections. The 3 big tanks were full, giving us enough fuel to run the generator, heat the house, and cook for weeks if necessary. Emma and I were ready. Most of our neighbors were making similar preparations, running generators, checking furnaces, buying out the grocery stores. But there was one group that had a serious problem, and they did not realize it yet. Pinewood Heights had been built in phases. The original section where I lived had been constructed 15 years ago. Each home had individual utility connections, individual heating systems, individual everything. But 5 years ago, the developer had added a new section of townhomes on the eastern edge of the property. These were high-end units, selling for $500,000 each, designed for wealthy retirees and young professionals who wanted maintenance-free living. The townhomes had a shared heating system. The developer had installed a central plant that burned propane to generate hot water, which was then circulated through all 48 units. It was efficient, cost-effective, and meant the townhome owners did not have to worry about individual furnace maintenance. The central plant was managed by a facilities company, which handled fuel delivery, maintenance, and repairs. Brenda lived in one of these townhomes. So did Richard, Patricia, and Marcus. In fact, most of the HOA board lived in the townhome section, which explained why they were so disconnected from the concerns of single-family homeowners like me. The problem, as I learned later, was that the facilities management company had been cutting corners. They had been delaying propane deliveries to save money, running the tanks closer to empty than recommended. And they used the same unreliable propane supplier that I had abandoned, the one that kept missing deliveries and showing up late. The blizzard was forecast to hit on Monday night, November 22nd. That Sunday, I saw the propane delivery truck arrive at the townhome complex, but something was wrong. The driver spent maybe 30 minutes there, far less time than it should take to fill the massive tanks that served the central heating plant. I found out later that the delivery was only partial. The propane company was running low on supply due to the upcoming storm and was rationing deliveries. The townhome complex received about 40% of what they had requested, just enough to get through a few days if the weather was mild. But the weather was not going to be mild. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The mountains had disappeared behind a wall of clouds, and the wind had that bone-chilling quality that promised snow. I spent the day working from home, watching the forecasts become increasingly dire. The National Weather Service issued a blizzard warning. The governor activated the National Guard. Schools closed preemptively. By evening, the first flakes started falling. Within an hour, it was a whiteout. The wind howled like something alive, driving the snow horizontally, piling it against houses and cars and anything that dared exist above ground. The temperature dropped steadily. -5 by 10 o'clock, -10 by midnight, -15 by 2 in the morning. Our power went out around 3 a.m. I heard the sudden silence as the refrigerator stopped humming, saw the darkness through my eyelids. But I was prepared. I got up, went to the basement and started the generator. Within minutes, we had power again. The propane system kicked in to supplement the electric heating, keeping the house warm despite the screaming wind outside. Tuesday morning looked like another planet. I peered through the frosted windows at a landscape buried under snow. The drifts were already 5 feet high in places, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. The wind was so strong that standing upright outside would be nearly impossible. Emma came downstairs wrapped in her bathrobe, even though the house was toasty. "How bad is it?" "Bad. We are not going anywhere for a while." "Good thing you have those tanks." She kissed my cheek, a pointed reminder of the ongoing HOA battle. I checked my phone, surprised I still had service. The cell towers must have backup power. The neighborhood Facebook group was exploding with activity. People posting photos of the snow, checking on elderly neighbors, asking who had power. And then I saw Brenda's post. "Urgent, townhome heating system has failed. Central plant is out of propane. Many elderly residents in need of heat. Does anyone have extra space in their homes?" The timestamp showed she had posted it at 6:47 a.m. The comments were already piling up. People expressing concern, offering blankets, asking questions. But the reality was harsh. In this weather, moving elderly residents anywhere was incredibly dangerous. And most of the single-family homes were dealing with their own power outages and heating challenges. I stared at the post for a long moment. Part of me, the petty part that had been dealing with Brenda's harassment for 2 months, felt a surge of vindication. She had spent all this time and energy trying to force me to remove my propane storage, and now she was in desperate need of the exact resource I had in abundance. But I am not that petty. Or at least, I try not to be. I called the non-emergency number for the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, which was being used as a coordination center for storm response. I explained the situation with the townhomes, the failed heating system, the elderly residents at risk. The dispatcher sounded exhausted. "Sir, we have multiple emergencies across the county. Response times are severely delayed. Are there any immediate medical emergencies?" "Not yet, but there will be if 48 housing units do not get heat soon. It is -18 degrees outside." "Can the residents relocate to warming centers?" "Not in this weather. The snow is too deep and the wind is too strong. People would die trying to walk out." "What about neighbors taking people in?" "Maybe some, but most homes are on limited power." "I am calling because I have a possible solution, but I need to know if you can facilitate emergency propane delivery once the storm clears." I explained about my large storage tanks, my generator, and my heating capacity. If I could share propane with the townhome complex, we could keep their central plant running until a proper delivery arrived. But I needed to know that delivery was actually coming, because I did not want to drain my own supply and then be stranded. The dispatcher put me on hold, then transferred me to someone in emergency management. That person transferred me to someone else. I spent 45 minutes on the phone, explaining the situation repeatedly, until finally reaching a coordinator who understood the urgency. "If you can provide temporary propane sharing, we will prioritize a delivery to your neighborhood as soon as roads are passable. But that might be several days." "I understand." I just need to know it is coming. You have my word, Mr. O'Brien, and thank you for stepping up. A lot of people would not. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while, thinking through the logistics. I had 3 500-gallon tanks, currently at about 90% capacity. That was roughly 1,350 gallons of propane. My house would use maybe 10 to 15 gallons per day during weather this extreme. The townhome complex, with 48 units, probably used several hundred gallons per day. If I shared my propane, I could keep both my house and the townhomes running for maybe 3 or 4 days before I would need to start rationing. The storm was expected to last 2 days, with another day or two before roads would be passable. It would be tight, but possible. There was one major problem, though. I had no way to easily transport propane from my tanks to the townhome complex. The systems were not connected, and running a hose or pipe across several hundred yards of buried neighborhood streets was not exactly practical. I needed to talk to someone who knew the townhome heating system, which meant I needed to talk to the facilities management company or the HOA board or both, which meant I needed to talk to Brenda. I looked at Emma, who had been reading over my shoulder. I need to go out. In this. Keith, you will freeze to death. The townhomes are maybe a quarter-mile away. I have the snowmobile. We had bought the snowmobile last winter, more as a toy than a necessity, but it was about to prove its worth. I bundled up in every layer I owned, looking like a puffy marshmallow by the time I was done. The snowmobile was in the garage, fueled and ready. The world outside was incomprehensible. The wind nearly knocked me over the moment I opened the garage door. Snow blasted into my face, stinging exposed skin like needles. The temperature was so low that breathing hurt. I got the snowmobile started and headed out. The street was invisible, just a river of white. I navigated by memory and by the dim shapes of houses looming out of the snow. The quarter-mile journey took nearly 15 minutes, fighting through drifts and wind. The townhome complex had a main entrance leading to a central courtyard. I found it more by luck than navigation, the buildings forming a windbreak that provided relative shelter. I could see lights in some units, probably battery-powered. Smoke came from a few chimneys, people burning whatever they could in decorative fireplaces that were never meant for serious heat. I parked the snowmobile and struggled to the nearest door, pounding hard enough to be heard over the wind. An elderly man answered, wrapped in what looked like every blanket he owned. "I need to find Brenda Morrison," I shouted over the noise. "Building C, Unit 12. He pointed vaguely. "Are you from emergency services?" Something like that. Building C was around the courtyard. I found Unit 12 and knocked. Brenda answered almost immediately, and the expression on her face when she recognized me was priceless. Shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope all flickered across her features. "Keith, what are you doing here? Can I come in?" "Kind of freezing out here." She stepped aside, and I entered a living room that was barely warmer than the outdoors. I could see my breath. Brenda was wearing a heavy coat, gloves, and a hat. Richard Chen sat on the couch, looking miserable. Patricia Donovan was there too, wrapped in a sleeping bag. "How bad is it?" I asked. "The heat went out around 5 this morning. We have no backup system. The central plant just stopped." Brenda's voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, no longer imperious or demanding. "You ran out of propane. The delivery company said we had enough for a week." They lied. Or they miscalculated. Does not matter now. What matters is getting you heat before people start dying of hypothermia. Richard spoke up, his teeth chattering. "We tried calling emergency services. They said they cannot get here." "I know. I talked to them. They have bigger problems right now." I pulled out my phone and showed them the notes I had made. I can provide propane to run your central plant temporarily, but I need information about your system. How does it connect? What kind of volume do you need? Can it accept an external supply? Brenda stared at me. You would help us, after everything? I am not going to let people freeze to death over a property dispute, Brenda. I am not like you. That might have been harsher than necessary, but the cold was making me cranky. Brenda flinched but did not argue. The central plant is in Building A, basement level. I have the key. She grabbed a keychain from the counter. Marcus is the one who dealt with the facilities company. He would know more about the technical details. Where is Marcus? His unit. He has a fireplace, so several people went there to stay warm. We trudged through the courtyard to Building A, where Marcus Webb was hosting about 15 residents in a living room heated by a struggling fireplace. The temperature was marginally better than outside, maybe 35 degrees. People were huddled together, sharing blankets and body heat. Marcus looked up when we entered, his expensive suit replaced by ski gear. Keith, oh thank God. Someone said you might have a way to help. Maybe. Show me the heating system. The central plant was in a large basement room, accessible through a utility entrance. It was a sophisticated setup, professionally installed, with a large propane-fired boiler that heated water, pumps that circulated it through underground pipes to all 48 units, and control systems that managed temperature and flow. The propane tanks were outside, buried underground for aesthetic reasons, with fill valves accessible through small caps at ground level. Marcus showed me the system diagrams which the facilities company had left in a binder. I studied the setup, thinking through the options. The buried tanks were empty or close enough to make no difference, but the system had intake valves designed to accept propane delivery. In theory, I could connect a supply line from my tanks to these valves. I need to get back to my house and work out the logistics, I told Marcus. This is doable, but it will not be quick or easy. Whatever you need, we will pay you, obviously. The HOA has emergency funds. We can talk about that later. Right now, we focus on not freezing. The ride back to my house was even worse than the first journey. The storm was intensifying, and the wind had shifted, creating new drifts that nearly buried the snowmobile. By the time I got home, I was shaking with cold despite all my layers. Emma had hot coffee waiting, bless her. I stripped off the frozen outer layers and sat by the fireplace, trying to warm up enough to think clearly. Well, she asked, it is possible, but I need help. This is not a one-person job. Over the next hour, I made calls to everyone I could think of. Miguel, the contractor who had installed my tanks, answered on the fourth ring. Miguel, it is Keith O'Brien. I need help with an emergency propane setup. In this weather, Keith, I am snowed in like everyone else. I know, but I have people freezing. If you can talk me through this, I will do the work myself. He listened to my explanation, then was quiet for a moment. You are talking about running a temporary supply line across several hundred feet in the middle of a blizzard to connect two separate systems. That is insane. I know. Can it be done? Technically, yes. I have the equipment you would need in my workshop, but there is no way I can get it to you. Where is your workshop? Longmont. About 20 miles from you. Keith, the roads are completely impassable. Can you walk me through what I need? Maybe I can improvise something. Miguel sighed, but he understood the stakes. For the next 30 minutes, he explained the technical requirements. I needed flexible high-pressure hoses rated for propane, proper couplings and fittings, pressure regulators, and safety valves. The hoses would need to be long enough to stretch from my property to the townhome complex, which meant at least 1,000 feet of line. You are not going to find all that just lying around, Miguel said. Maybe not, but I know someone who might have some of it. That someone was Tom Henderson, my neighbor and a retired petroleum engineer. Tom had a workshop that was legendary in the neighborhood, full of specialized equipment and supplies from his 40-year career in oil and gas. If anyone had random propane fittings and high-pressure hose, it would be Tom. I called him, explained the situation, and asked if he had any relevant supplies. "Funny you should ask," Tom said. "I have about 800 feet of high-pressure hose left over from a project I consulted on last year, and I definitely have fittings. But Keith, you understand how dangerous this is, right? Propane is not forgiving. One mistake and you could cause an explosion." "I know. That is why I need your help. Can you come over in this storm?" "Tom, people are going to start freezing to death if we do not do something." There was a pause. "Give me an hour. I need to dig myself out first." While waiting for Tom, I made more calls. Several other neighbors had technical expertise that could help. James Park, an electrician, knew about generators and power systems. David Ramirez, a plumber, understood pressure systems and fluid flow. Sarah Chen, Richard's sister and a mechanical engineer, had design experience with heating systems. One by one, they agreed to help. Some had to snowshoe over. Others used snowmobiles or just trudged through the drifts on foot. By late afternoon, I had 7 people gathered in my living room, planning an emergency propane supply operation in the middle of a historic blizzard. Emma made sandwiches and coffee, keeping everyone fed while we worked through the details. Tom had brought his supplies on a sled pulled behind his snowmobile, and we spread everything out in the garage. "This is what we are going to do," I said, pointing to the hand-drawn diagram Sarah had sketched. "We run the supply line from my tanks along the street to the townhome central plant. We cannot bury it in this weather, so it will be surface level, which means we need to protect it from the cold and the wind." "Propane does not freeze," David pointed out. "No, but the fittings can fail if they get cold enough, and we need to minimize pressure loss. We will pack snow around the hose to insulate it." "That is actually brilliant," Sarah said. "Snow is an excellent insulator. We also need to monitor pressure constantly. If we get a leak, we shut down immediately. Propane is heavier than air, which means it sinks and can accumulate in low areas. In this wind, that is less of a concern, but we still need to be careful." James had brought portable gas detectors from his work truck, devices designed to sense propane leaks. We would place them at intervals along the supply line and at both connection points. The plan was ambitious and risky, but everyone agreed it was possible. We spent another hour assembling the equipment, testing connections, and making sure we had everything we needed. By the time we were ready to start the installation, it was early evening and completely dark. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind was a constant roar, and the temperature had dropped to -22 degrees. We worked in teams. Tom and I handled the connection at my tanks, carefully attaching the supply line to one of my storage units and installing pressure regulators and safety valves. James set up the monitoring equipment, placing gas detectors every 100 feet. David and Sarah led the team running the hose along the street, packing it with snow for insulation, and marking its location with reflective poles so people would not trip over it once the storm cleared. It was brutal work. Even with all our cold weather gear, the temperature was dangerous. We could only work for 15 or 20 minutes before needing to warm up inside someone's house. The wind kept knocking us over. The snow was so deep that we had to shovel paths just to move equipment, but we kept at it. Hour after hour, foot by foot, we ran that supply line through the neighborhood. Other residents came out to help when they saw what we were doing. Mrs. Patterson, An 80-year-old widow made hot chocolate and brought it out in thermoses. The Gonzalez family set up their garage as a warming station, with space heaters running off their generator. By midnight, we had reached the townhome complex. Marcus and several townhome residents had shoveled access to the central plant's fill valves, and we began the delicate process of making the final connection. This was the moment of truth. If we had made any mistakes, if the seals were not tight, if the pressure was wrong, we could have a catastrophic failure. Tom and David triple-checked every connection while Sarah monitored the pressure gauges. "Ready?" Tom asked. "Ready," I confirmed. We opened the valve at my tank slowly, watching the pressure build in the line. The gauges crept upward. 20 psi, 40 psi, 60 psi. James walked the entire line with his gas detector, checking for leaks. Nothing. At the townhome end, Marcus stood by the central plant controls, ready to restart the system once propane was flowing. Sarah gave him a thumbs up, and he opened the intake valve. For a moment, nothing happened. Then we heard it, the faint sound of gas flowing through pipes, the click of valves responding, the rumble of the boiler igniting. The central heating plant roared to life. A cheer went up from the townhome residents who had gathered to watch. People were crying, hugging each other, celebrating. Within minutes, hot water would be flowing through the pipes to every unit. Within an hour, those apartments would be warm again. Brenda stood to the side, watching. When our eyes met, she looked away, shame evident on her face. We spent another hour making sure the system was stable, monitoring pressure, checking for leaks, and confirming that heat was reaching all the units. Everything held. The temporary supply line was working. By 2 in the morning, exhausted and frozen to the bone, we finally called it done. The team dispersed, everyone heading home for well-deserved sleep. Tom and I were the last to leave, doing a final safety check. "You did a good thing tonight," Tom said. "We all did." "Yeah, but you started it. A lot of people would have let them freeze after how Brenda treated you." "I thought about it," I admitted, "for about 5 seconds. But then I remembered that 48 families live there, and most of them never did anything to me. This was not about Brenda. It was about doing the right thing." Wednesday morning, the storm was finally breaking. The wind had dropped to a more reasonable 20 miles per hour, and the snow had become lighter, just occasional flurries. The temperature was still -15, but at least the sun was trying to come out. I spent the morning checking the propane supply line, making sure the overnight cold had not caused any problems. Everything was holding. My tanks were down to about 60% capacity, which was concerning but manageable if the promised delivery came through in the next day or two. Emma and I were having late breakfast when there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Brenda standing there, looking small and uncertain in a way I had never seen. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside. Emma looked up from her coffee, her expression neutral but not hostile. Brenda stood in our entryway, not taking off her coat, as if she did not expect to stay long. "I wanted to thank you, personally. What you did last night saved lives. The Harringtons in Unit 32 are both in their 80s with health issues. Mrs. Patterson in Unit 8 has emphysema. There are 6 families with young children. They would not have survived much longer without heat. You are welcome," I said simply. I also wanted to apologize. This seemed harder for her. "I have been unreasonable about the propane tanks. You were right. You had permits, you followed the law, and you had legitimate reasons for the installation. I let my desire for control override common sense." "Yes, you did." She flinched at the directness but did not argue. "The HOA board met this morning, emergency session. We are officially withdrawing all fines related to your propane tanks. We are also amending the covenants to explicitly allow utility storage equipment that meets county codes. That is a start. Is there anything else I can do to make this right? I thought about it. Yeah, there is. You can pay the legal fees I have incurred fighting your baseless fines. That is about $8,000 so far. Brenda nodded. Done. The HOA will cover it. And you can issue a formal apology in the next newsletter, explaining what happened and acknowledging that your enforcement was wrong. I can do that. And one more thing. I looked at Emma, who nodded encouragement. You need to change how you run the HOA. This authoritarian approach, fining people over trivial issues, prioritizing aesthetics over functionality, it has to stop. The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it. Brenda was quiet for a long moment. You are right. I have been treating this like my personal kingdom. My therapist has been telling me the same thing, actually. I think I threw myself into the HOA role after my divorce, needing something to control because everything else in my life felt chaotic. But that is not an excuse. I will do better. See that you do. Because if this continues, people are going to vote you out, and you will deserve it. She nodded and turned to leave, then paused. For what it is worth, you are a better person than I am. I do not think I would have helped someone who had been fighting with me the way I fought with you. Maybe that is something to work on with your therapist, I suggested. After she left, Emma came over and hugged me. You handled that well. I just want this to be over. I think it is, or at least the worst part is. Thursday morning, the roads were finally passable. The county had been working around the clock to clear major routes, and by noon, emergency vehicles could get through. True to their word, the emergency management coordinator I had spoken with arranged for a priority propane delivery. A massive tanker truck arrived mid-afternoon, escorted by a county snowplow. The driver, a grizzled man who had clearly been working non-stop for days, looked at my setup with professional admiration. You are the guy who rigged up the emergency supply line, he asked. With a lot of help, yeah. Heard about that on the radio. County officials are calling it a textbook example of community response. You probably saved a dozen lives. Just trying to help. He filled my tanks back to capacity, then went to refill the townhome complex's buried tanks. The crisis was officially over. Over the next few weeks, as Boulder County dug out from what meteorologists confirmed was indeed a historic blizzard, life slowly returned to normal. The final statistics were sobering. 8 people had died across the county from storm-related causes, mostly heart attacks from shoveling snow or hypothermia from being stranded. Property damage was in the tens of millions. But Pinewood Heights had come through with 0 casualties, and our community emergency response was featured in the local news as a success story. The HOA held a special meeting in December, with record attendance. Brenda formally apologized for her handling of my propane tank situation, announced the covenant amendments, and presented a check for my legal fees. She also announced that she would be stepping down as HOA president at the end of her term. I have learned a hard lesson about leadership, she told the assembled residents. Being in charge is not about control, it is about service. I failed to serve this community properly, and I am grateful that people like Keith O'Brien showed me what real service looks like. It was a surprisingly gracious speech, and I actually felt a little bad for her. She was clearly trying to change, which took courage. Susan Fletcher was elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of common sense enforcement and community collaboration. One of her first acts was to create a formal emergency preparedness committee, with me as the chair. We developed plans for future weather emergencies, established communication protocols, and identified residents who might need special assistance. The propane tanks remained in place, of course, still screened by their decorative fence, still ready for the next emergency. They became something of a neighborhood landmark. People would point them out to visitors, telling the story of the blizzard and the emergency supply line. In late January, Miguel stopped by with a surprise. "I made something for you," he said, pulling a brass plaque from his truck. It read, "These tanks saved lives. November 2025. "You do not need to do that," I protested. "Yeah, I do. What you did was extraordinary, Keith. You had every reason to say no, to let them deal with their own problems after how they treated you, but you chose to help anyway. That deserves recognition." We mounted the plaque on the fence surrounding the tanks. It is still there, a reminder of what happened and why it mattered. Emma and I hosted a neighborhood party in February, once the worst of winter had passed. It was supposed to be just a few people, but word spread, and we ended up with over 60 residents crowded into our house and yard. People brought food, drinks, and stories from the blizzard. Tom regaled everyone with tales of running the supply line in the dark. Sarah showed off photos she had taken during the operation. The Gonzalez kids who had helped shovel paths were treated like heroes. Brenda showed up late, looking nervous. But people welcomed her, maybe recognizing that holding grudges was not productive. She had been humbled by the experience, and she was genuinely trying to be better. I saw her talking with Susan Fletcher, offering advice on HOA management, but deferring to Susan's authority in a way she never would have before. At one point, Richard Chen pulled me aside. "I owe you an apology, too. I went along with Brenda's crusade against your tanks because it was easier than standing up to her. That was cowardly." "Yeah, it was, but you are here now, which counts for something. For what it is worth, the Townhome Association is installing backup propane storage. We never want to be in that position again, and we are using you as a reference for the contractor. Miguel does good work. You will be happy with him." As the party wound down and people started heading home, I stood on my back deck with Emma, looking out at the mountains. The moon was bright, illuminating the snow-covered peaks. "Do you regret it?" Emma asked. "All the hassle with the HOA, the legal fees, the drama, not even a little bit. We did what we needed to do and we were ready when it mattered. That is worth any amount of hassle." "You know, Brenda told me something interesting earlier. She said the experience changed her whole perspective on community. She is volunteering with a homeless shelter now, using her organizational skills to help people instead of control them." "Really? That is good. Everyone deserves a second chance. Even HOA tyrants, even them, though I am keeping the tanks no matter what." Emma laughed. "I would expect nothing less." March brought the official end to the whole saga. The Boulder County Board of Supervisors held a ceremony honoring residents who had shown exceptional community service during the blizzard. Tom, Miguel, David, Sarah, James, and I all received commendations. The county also used our emergency propane supply line as a case study, developing guidelines for similar situations in other communities. A reporter from the Denver Post did a feature story on what had become known as the Pinewood Heights blizzard response. The article detailed everything from Brenda's initial HOA overreach to the emergency installation of the supply line to the eventual resolution. It was picked up by national outlets, and for a few days, we were minor celebrities. I did a couple of phone interviews, mostly trying to redirect attention to the whole team rather than just myself. But the narrative that people found most compelling was the irony of the situation. HOA bans propane tanks, then needs those exact tanks to survive. It was too perfect a story for journalists to resist. The attention had unexpected benefits. The propane delivery company that had been so unreliable got called out in the article, and they lost contracts across the region. A more reliable supplier moved into the area, and suddenly, everyone had better service. Several other HOAs revised their covenants to allow utility storage after seeing what happened. And at least a dozen homeowners in Pinewood Heights installed their own backup propane systems, inspired by our experience. By April, as spring finally arrived and the snow melted, life in Pinewood Heights had settled into a new normal. The HOA was less controlling, more collaborative. Brenda was a regular person again, not a tyrant. The community felt closer, bound together by the shared experience of surviving something extreme. I was in my backyard on a sunny Saturday morning, working in the garden that Emma had started planning, when Susan Fletcher stopped by. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Sure. What's up?" "The HOA wants to do something to formally recognize what you did during the blizzard. We are thinking about naming the community center meeting room after you. The O'Brien Community Room. What do you think?" I considered it. "I appreciate the thought, but I would rather you did something else." "What?" "Take the money you would spend on a plaque or renaming ceremony and use it to create an emergency preparedness fund. Make sure every household has information about winter safety, backup power, heating alternatives. Set up a buddy system for elderly residents. Make sure we are ready if something like this happens again." Susan smiled. "That is exactly the kind of response I expected from you. We will do it. The Keith O'Brien Emergency Preparedness Fund. Just call it the Pinewood Heights Emergency Fund." This was never about me. It was about all of us. You are impossible to honor, you know that, I know, but I appreciate the effort. As Susan left, Emma came out with 2 glasses of iced tea. We sat on the deck, enjoying the sunshine and the sight of our mountains, no longer hidden by storm clouds. "Any regrets?" she asked. "Not a single one, though I could do without ever experiencing negative 20-degree weather again." "Agreed, but we proved we could handle it." "That we did." I looked at the propane tanks, still sitting behind their decorative fence, no longer a source of controversy, but instead a symbol of preparedness and community resilience. They were just utilitarian objects, metal cylinders holding compressed gas, but they represented something more now. They represented the choice to prepare rather than hope, to help rather than hold grudges, to do what was right even when it was difficult. The whole experience had taught me something valuable about community. It is easy to be neighbors when everything is comfortable. The real test comes when things get hard, when resources are scarce, when people are frightened and cold and desperate. That is when you find out what kind of person you are and what kind of community you have built. I like to think we passed that test. Not perfectly, not without conflict and mistakes, but ultimately, we came through together. The HOA learned that rules without reason lead to rebellion. Brenda learned that control is not the same as leadership. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but compassion. The propane tanks remain in place, well-maintained and ready. We refill them every fall now, a routine part of winter preparation. Other neighbors have installed similar systems, creating a network of backup resources across the community. The Emergency Preparedness Committee meets quarterly, updating plans and conducting training. Last November, as the first anniversary of the blizzard approached, the community held a remembrance event. We gathered at the community center, shared stories, and renewed our commitment to looking out for each other. Someone had created a photo display showing the emergency supply line installation, and people kept stopping to look at the images of neighbors working together in impossible conditions. Brenda spoke briefly, Her remarks focused on gratitude and growth. "A year ago, I was a different person," she said. "I thought being in charge meant making people follow rules. I was wrong. Leadership is about service. Community is about compassion. I am grateful to everyone who showed me that, especially those I had wronged." It was a fitting end to the drama that had defined that winter. We had started from a place of conflict and ended in community. The tanks that had been a source of contention became instruments of survival. And the HOA that had tried to ban them eventually celebrated them. As I sit here now, looking back on everything that happened, I am struck by how quickly things can change. In the span of a few months, I went from being harassed by the HOA to being honored by the county. Brenda went from tyrant to volunteer. Our neighborhood went from divided to united. And those propane tanks went from violations to lifesavers. The lesson, I suppose, is that crisis reveals character, both good and bad. It strips away pretense and forces people to choose who they really want to be. Some rise to the occasion. Others learn and grow from their failures. And a few lucky communities discover that they have the strength and compassion to weather any storm. Pinewood Heights is one of those communities now. We know what we can endure together. We know that our neighbor's problem is our problem, that individual preparedness contributes to collective security, and that helping each other is not just morally right, but practically essential. The propane tanks still sit behind their fence, quietly holding their fuel, ready for whatever comes next. They are not much to look at, just industrial equipment doing its job. But to everyone in Pinewood Heights, they mean something more. They are a reminder that preparation matters, that community matters, and that sometimes the things people try to ban are exactly what they will need to survive. And me. I am just a guy who installed some tanks and refused to back down when the HOA overreached. But that stubbornness, combined with a willingness to help even those who had wronged me, made all the difference. I do not think of myself as a hero. Heroes are people who do extraordinary things. I just did what seemed necessary and right. But if my experience can teach others anything, let it be this. Stand up for what is right, even when it is inconvenient. Prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Help your neighbors, even the difficult ones. And never underestimate the power of community when people choose compassion over conflict. The tanks remain, quiet sentinels against the next storm. And I remain ready, knowing that whatever challenges come, we will face them together.